Okay, we're very happy to have Stephen Redding speak to us today. Hello, observers from outside, David and Tom. Maybe other people, I don't know, but you're welcome. The title of the paper is "The Distributional Consequences of Trade: Evidence from the Grain Invasion." And we have Stephen is now the Harold Shapiro Professor at Princeton. And this is jointly with two other co-authors who are not here to join you, but they're part of the.
They've abandoned me to that.
And we're anxious to hear you. This is our Economic Policy Working Group, and we're happy to see you. You met him already. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that generous introduction. So this paper is on distributional consequences of trade, evidence from the grain invasion, and it's a joint paper with Stefan Heblich and Janos Zylberberg. So what's the motivation for this paper? Well, as you all know, there's renewed interest in the distributional consequences of international trade, following on in particular from work looking at the China shock here in the United States. So what we wanted to do in this paper is present some new theory and evidence on those distributional consequences, using one of the largest, most historically influential trade shocks in history, the New World grain invasion that occurred in the second half of the 19th century, into, in particular, British markets following the so-called repeal of the Corn Laws, a major trade liberalization reform in 1846. So traditional research on that trade shock and other trade shocks has typically tended to focus on economy-wide distributional effects of trade, looking either between factors of production, say labor versus land, as in the Hex-Rollin model of trade, or between different sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, as in the specific factors model of trade. But what we're going to argue is that this research on the grain invasion has kind of neglected geography as an important dimension for those distributional consequences of this international trade shock. And so to provide that evidence, we're going to put together a new data set, spatially disaggregated data set on population, employment, and property values for around 11,000 locations in England and Wales over 100 years from 1801 to 1901. The advantage of this empirical setting is we're going to have an exogenous measure of exposure to this trade shock based on agroclimatic conditions for the suitability for cultivating wheat. So that's going to determine how exposed locations are to this grain invasion in the second half of the 19th century. And then we're going to develop a quantitative spatial model to rationalize our findings and evaluate the aggregate and income distributional effects of this trade shock. So what do we find? As I know, lively looking forward to all of your questions and comments. I want to make sure I get across some of the key takeaways at the beginning. So one kind of key feature, advantage of our empirical setting, which we think enables us to credibly estimate the effect of this trade shock, is if you've ever been to England and Wales, you know that it rains a lot. And in particular, it rains much more in the west of the country than in the eastern part of the country. So in particular, there's a warm ocean current called the North Atlantic Drift, and prevailing southwesterly winds that bring moist air over England and Wales and mean that western areas have much more cloud cover, more precipitation, and lower average temperatures than eastern areas. And those western areas are also more mountainous, which contributes to that greater precipitation. So as a result of those differences in agroclimatic conditions, that's going to mean that the western parts of the country are much more suitable for pastoral farming, in other words, grazing cows and sheep and animals, whereas the eastern parts of the country are much more suitable for growing cereal grains, and hence are going to be more exposed to this trade shock. So this is a pure kind of exogenous measure of exposure based on these agroclimatic conditions. John?
Exposure also depends on what else you could do with the land. Are there no substitutes for wheat on eastern lands?
Right, so great question. I'll show you some data on that. So there is substitution. As you pointed out, you can use land in the east for grazing of cattle and sheep if you want. It's just relatively less productive. And so in the model, we're going to have that substitution. We're going to have a number of different goods, and each location is going to have comparative advantages in those different goods. And so when relative prices change, you can reallocate to the other things, the substitution. And that extent of substitution is going to be informed by initial patterns of specialization and some elasticities in the model.
Just to follow up, normally when you think about it in terms of trade shock, it's based on how much you actually import, how much you actually export. It's not, would I be good at making cars? It's, do I actually produce cars or oil or whatever, right?
Yep, absolutely. So in the paper, and in particular in the appendix, we have this appendix where we show you that if you look at actual production of agricultural commodities, it's strongly related to this measure of wheat suitability, so approximately log linearly related. So if you look at both the share of land used to grow wheat, and if you look at the average yield of wheat, it's very, very strongly related to this measure of agroclimatic conditions. And wheat is the main grain that's grown in England and Wales at the time. Barley is the second biggest, but wheat is by far the biggest.
The mechanism is rooted in one variable, but you're saying the thing is correlated with that, but you measure the thing that the mechanism is rooted in. So why would you not just go straight to the?
So we think the advantage of our strategy is that our measure of exposure is exogenous,
Yes.
that is really driven by agroclimatic conditions. Whereas when you think about production, that's endogenous. It'll be influenced by this exogenous thing, but then it'll be influenced by a whole bunch of other endogenous things. And so the nice advantage of this measure is it's completely determined by the climate. It's not affected by other economic factors. But we definitely validate carefully in the paper that this exogenous measure is very strongly correlated with what you think it should be correlated with, namely area of wheat grown and average yield of wheat. Yeah, great question. So what do we find? Some of the takeaways. So the first bit of the paper will provide some kind of reduced form evidence to really just try to convince you that we're finding effects of the grain invasion rather than something else. So we'll walk through some alternative explanations, provide you some evidence that we really think we're capturing the grain invasion. So in that reduced form part of the paper, we'll show you that the population in the eastern parts of the country declines by around 18% in high wheat suitable regions relative to low wheat suitable regions. And property values drop by around 24% over the second half of the 19th century. We'll document structural transformation away from agriculture. So when this trade shock hits, we'll see a reallocation of employment out of agriculture. Then when we drill down within agriculture, related to John's question, we'll see there's a reallocation away from cereal farming towards pastoral farming. And that reallocation is particularly big in the eastern parts that are initially more suitable for cultivating wheat. And then we'll also provide evidence on outmigration from rural regions in response to this international trade shock.
So eventually we want to speculate something about welfare. This might have been the best thing that ever happened to them. Get the hell off the farm, go to the factories. It's where you belong in 1820 England.
Absolutely. So great question. And you're ahead of me. You anticipated exactly that last bullet point. So then in the second bit of the paper, to take that comment on board, we'll actually develop a quantitative spatial model. And as John is anticipating, in the model, there's going to be aggregate gains from trade. So because, this is a neoclassical trade model, trade exposes you to different relative prices at the aggregate economy-wide level, there are aggregate gains, and we'll use the model to quantify those and give you some numbers on that. But then at the local level, there can be these distributional consequences where individual locations can lose. And to really answer that bit of the question, you really need the model, right? Because the model is going to tell you, it's going to provide a measure of real income and of welfare within the context of the model. And so the model will highlight modest aggregate gains, but much larger distributional consequences. Yeah, great question.
Steve.
Yep.
So England is a really old country. It was an agricultural country back 2,000 years. All the trees were already chopped down. In a sense, if we compare it to North America, there's this margin of trying to develop the country, right? Taking the trees down and up. You don't have that issue at all. It's already there.
Yeah, no, exactly. So we think that's actually another advantage in empirical assessing is that we can kind of think about ourselves as being roughly in something like a steady state equilibrium. Obviously, many things are changing in the data, but roughly like a steady state equilibrium, and then being hit by this trade shock. Whereas in North America, we're very much out of steady state as the continent's explored and populated. Yeah, that's a great point. So another thing the model will help us do is it'll help us control for other determinants of economic activity. So obviously other things happened in England and Wales during this time period, and I'll show how the model allows us to control for that. And as we're just discussing, one of the kind of key takeaways is this geography is this kind of neglected and large dimension along which the distributional consequences of trade occur. In terms of related literature, I'll be very brief, just for the interest of time. We're obviously speaking to a wide body of research by existing scholars here, both empirical work on local labor market effects of trade, macro literature on structural transformation, and then also within trade, or recent literature on quantitative spatial models. The novel thing we're doing here is using this natural experiment of the grain invasion, confronting a quantitative spatial model with it, and using that shock to document how trade can drive structural transformation and reallocation across economic activities. So just a little beginning, I'll spend a bit on the historical background. Many of you know a lot about the history, but just I'll briefly kind of tease out some of the relevant factors going into the trade shock. Then I'll get into the data, show you the evidence, trying to be as transparent as possible so you can really kind of see what's driving things in the data. And then on the model, I'm not going to have a lot of time today, but I'll try to give you a feel for the model, how it works, with what the key assumptions are, why it's useful, connecting it to the data, and then what the takeaways are for aggregate gains and distributional consequences. Yeah, John.
Since you may not get to it, I think I can ask the question now. This is not a purely intellectual question. Right now, we're talking about trade restrictions because we want to go in and bring back the 1950s and protect our industries and so forth. Are you going to do, what policies might have been better? Let's protect the wheat jobs and probably.
Right.
We go to that flavor anytime we say inequality is a matter, but I can't see any concrete alternative policy that they could have followed that would have made anything better off.
So we'll do two things in the model today. So we'll do two kind of factual exercises. One is kind of focusing on the immediate impact of the trade liberalization. So in this context, trade policy is going in the other direction, right? We had protection and it's being abolished. And so we'll do that kind of factual. So we'll directly inform that policy question. Then we'll do a second kind of factual, which kind of speaks to the fact that once you're open to trade, what happens in your trade partners can also affect your welfare. And so in particular, this New World Grain Invasion is about the linking of the Midwest with international markets and the trade shock that results, which is a little bit analogous to the China shock. Once China's open, as it grows, that growth also generates distributional consequences. You can also use the model. We don't do it in the current version of the model, but you could also simulate tariffs and trade inside of the model. And if you protect the grain growing industry, it's going to have the opposite effects of the liberalization we're going to document as you're anticipating. And again, there would be an aggregate effect between factors and industries, but also a geographic effect. And so I completely agree with you. It's very much connected to debates today about protection, in particular across the board tariffs and what the aggregate effects might be, aggregate welfare losses, but there'll be some distributional benefits. Some individuals, some firms, some industries will benefit from those tariffs.
Does the model of the fact that the US is a mature economy, so this notion that you are industrializing faster out of the shock differs compared to what happened in the US, where the shock was concentrated heavily disproportionately affecting negatively areas of the US where people couldn't retrain from being truck drivers to be nurses or
right. So we will
IT professionals.
It's a great question. We will speak to some of that debate. So when we look at the geographically uneven impact, in our context, which actually maps quite closely to the historical experience, the main distributional impacts will be on landlords, the owners of lands, and I'll say more about that in a moment. We actually found there's quite a bit of mobility in Britain's economy during the 19th century. I'll show you some direct data on that and some evidence on the impact of the trade shock moving people around. And that's actually one thing that's very interesting here is that the work on the US today has found that population mobility is much more muted. And then in that circumstance, there's going to be more of a local impact on workers as you're highlighting, absolutely. And that's sort of one interesting feature of our findings.
Truck drivers did great, by the way. The China shock was great for truck drivers.
Yeah, that's not a very good example. Yes.
Let me get in and tell you a little bit about the experiment. So what are the corn laws? So firstly, corn in Britain means any kind of cereal grain. It's an old British word. So it's not just maize. It means wheat, barley, oats, any kind of cereal grain. Wheat is by far the most important.
Hang on.
Yeah, apologies for using that historical language. It was just based on the context. And so where does this trade protection come from? Well, the origins go way back in time, partly about the monarch being concerned about the price of bread as the main sustenance for the population. And so restrictions on trading grain were related to that. Initially, Britain was mostly self-sufficient in wheat. In fact, in the 1700s, for several years, it was a net exporter of wheat. But towards the end of the 1700s, as the Industrial Revolution takes place in Britain, there's rapid population growth and economic growth. And that means that Britain starts to become a net importer of wheat, initially mainly from Prussia and Russia in Europe. And obviously, in the very late 19th century, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars break out between 1792 and 1815. During that period, for most of it, Britain and France are at war, and so Britain loses access to these traditional sources of imports of wheat, both because the continent is up in conflict, and also because Napoleon actually has a blockade where he prevents a trade with Britain from the continent. And so as a result of that, I'll show you some evidence. There's a large rise in the domestic price of wheat and an expansion of domestic wheat production. Then in 1815, in the coming of victory at the end of the war, the Conservative Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, is essentially concerned that now the war's over, if we allow free imports of wheat, there's going to be a large drop in the domestic price of agriculture, and that has the scope to create agricultural crisis, agricultural laborers rebelling, protesting, and so on. And so motivated by that concern, Britain enacts a sharp increase in levels of protection on wheat. So the Corn Law of 1815, it actually bans imports of wheat when the domestic price is below a threshold. And as a result of that, British ports are largely closed to wheat imports until 1825. So that then creates the scope for political conflict related to John's questions between the people who benefit from that protection. Who are they? Well, they're the landowners. And up until about 1876, around 3/4 of land in Britain is owned by on estates of more than 1,000 acres. So it's predominantly the aristocracy and the gentry who benefit from this higher price of wheat. Who are the people who lose from that? Well, that's the urban workers who pay more for their bread and the manufacturers who have to pay higher wages to those workers. So that created this potential for political conflict. Initially, the protests were muted because harvests were relatively plentiful. And then in the early 1840s, there's a sequence of bad harvests leading up to the Irish potato famine in 1845, which creates growing political protests and pressure about the fact that this protection is raising the domestic price of wheat and bread. And in response to that political pressure, Robert Peel, who's also a Conservative Prime Minister, a landowner, he is forced.
When I go to London, I stay in the Reform Club, and it was founded by those people, Richard Cobden. Okay, he's the brains behind this.
Yeah.
And you walk in there and there's a big picture of him and all of those other people. So, and the Reform Club was the Liberal Party. So it's kind of, you go there, you can actually see that story.
Absolutely, and it's really interesting from a trade point of view in the sense that Ricardo is also writing in 1817, and his writings on the gains in trade are actually inspired by this debate. He's writing to this debate, and absolutely, exactly as you said, Richard Cobden is leading the Anti-Corn Law League, which plays this kind of key role, and together with John Bight, which plays this key role in protesting against the Corn Laws. So basically, in response to that, Robert Peel, although he's a landowner, he's benefiting from protection. He, forces the legislation through Parliament, 30 nights of debate. It's very cataclysmic, splits his party, keeps it out of power in the next 2 decades. But Britain opens up to free trade in grains. What that means is that after the end of the American Civil War, when the railway network penetrates into the Midwest of the United States, onto the Canadian prairies and the Argentinian pampas, the Britain becomes exposed to this new world grain invasion. And I'll show you some evidence on that in a second. And it leads to what economic historians in Britain called the Great Agricultural Depression, which becomes particularly severe after 1870, and is particularly severe in the eastern grain-growing parts of the country.
The people who left the tired of that grain growing areas, not the gentry, but the workers. Do we know anything about whether they are actually better off 5 years later?
So in principle, we can say something about that. So as I'll say in a moment, another cool thing about this empirical setting is because it's back in time, we actually have the individual level census data with people's names. And so we can actually track them over time. So we can track people in a grain region, and we can see where do they move, which industry do they go to, which location do they go to. And I'll show you some evidence on that. We don't have wages in the population census, so we can't directly look at how well off they are in terms of their wages. We could do a little bit with occupational scores, which are kind of a proxy that historians use to measure income. One of the things I'll show you if I have time is that the migration is away from these rural grain growing areas to urban areas, and it's moving away from agriculture. So it's consistent with a reallocation out of the negatively hit sector.
But Steve, this story is sort of the beginning myth of globalization, right? It starts with the repeal of the Corn Laws, and that leads to the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, and then the whole opening of trade in Europe, right? And so what you're doing is saying, well, wait a minute, there were problems, but they always get glossed over in the story that we teach. I teach globalization. We teach the story about globalization and how all these wonderful things happen, and we kind of forgot about, well, also other things happen.
Yes.
Well, some aristocrats lost land
Yeah, that's-
value
I
that
mean,
they had
that's
gained
why-
because of
That's what,
somebody
is it
passed
just the
protection.
aristocrats who lost?
It's
or-
not just the
or is it- is
aristocrats,
it
so
the
I'll show you
work-
some evidence on that. So
Yeah, but
I'll show you some evidence on paupers. We've got some.
What about the other side? Cousins, I think, documented for tons and tons of countries. You start in agriculture, slowly go down over time. Manufacturing then comes up, reaches a peak somewhere like around Mexico, then goes back down, and services comes and kicks in. Closed, open, whatever. Every country is going through that. This might speed it up, slow it down. Someone's screwing around with the policies. So it's not, for sure, not a balanced growth path. We're doing these transitions and it interacts with it. There's some people get hurt in the short run, but it should not be. England would have stayed, 85% agricultural for the next 200 years. Should not be the baseline, of course.
Absolutely, and it's definitely not. So you'll see in the model that we develop a classic macro model of structural transformation,
Right.
and we have
And
different
this is
productivity
relative
growth.
to that path.
Exactly.
But just to add to that, most countries' policies want to speed that up, not slow it down.
Yeah.
No, the whole reason,
To speed it up,
the whole
they
reason
failed.
we're talking about tariffs now is to not to do high value added manufacturing and not low value added wheat. So
Yeah.
we're making interventions to exactly speed this up.
Right. So I guess we want to make 2 points. One is that I'm going to show you within the lens of our model that trade liberalization gives you aggregate gains.
Mhm.
Second point is that, but there are these large distributional consequences. You may not care about those, or depending on who they fall on, and that's totally, economists, we're just going to show you that there are these distributional gains, and it's important to think about that. So for example, some of the rise of populism in the United States could be related to those distributional effects. And as Pat hinted, in the background, there's going to be other structural transformation, and inside the model, we can tease out how much is trade, how much of these other macro forces. And within the macro literature, trade is kind of very interesting. Trade is kind of very consequential for that process of structural transformation. There's a very nice paper by Matsuyama in 1992 where he makes that point that if you think about a closed economy, if an economy is more productive, say in manufacturing, with inelastic demand between sectors, that leads to more than proportionate falls in prices, and so you reallocate towards services. But then, of course, in a trade, in an open economy, you can get this other effect, which is that the higher productivity growth gives you a comparative advantage. And so trade's going to interact in interesting ways with those other forces that, as Pat said, are very clearly going on in the data.
I was asking Steve is that all of these historical experiments clearly pertain to states of the world in which economies were growing, were developing, were transforming. It would be interesting through the model to see if you engineer the same type of experiment for someone who's way on the service Kuznets curve.
Right, no, absolutely. I think that'd be super interesting. You'll see one of the things we think about this model and why it's interesting, not just in this application, but in other applications. You're going to see the model's built so it can actually rationalize in equilibrium the evolution in the data. And in order to achieve that, as Pat's hinted at, you need unbalanced productivity growth. And actually inside the model, we can actually invert the model, back out the implied productivity growth and so on. And then when we think about trade, exactly as Pat hinted, when you think about these shock to trade, you obviously want to keep that stuff constant and do a counterfactual, which is all else equal. And that's what we're going to be able to do with the model, but we can't do without the model.
I still think when you start saying concern about inequality, changing redistribution, worrying about people who gained a lot of profits because of protection, losing that gain is a lot different than people who were just hit. And that's very relevant now. Unions got a lot of rents because of protection. Oh, is it horrible increases in inequality? Say, well, you're not going to get to feed at the taxpayer's trough anymore.
Right. Yeah, no, that's an important point that some of these initial incomes can be driven by misallocation, by rents, and so on. I'll show you some evidence that the negative impact on the trade shock is not just on the rich aristocracy. I'll show you some evidence on poverty and pauperism among poor workers, and so I'll come back to that later and also connect that.
Well, this whole system was a propped up artificial system, which we're removing and going back to, 1760.
Right. But I think what's important is that trade economists have been kind of very good on pushing the agenda for the gains from globalization. And we've also always made the argument that because there are aggregate gains as a Pareto improvement, the gainers can compensate the losers and everyone's at least as well off. But of course, in practice, that compensation never occurs. And so the point we want to make is, look, hey, wake up. There are these big distributional gains. We at least need to acknowledge them and think about their political implications, their income distribution implications.
My perception of the conversation, it's all about income distribution and nobody worries about the aggregate gains, but maybe I'm misperceiving.
Yeah, it's a great point. That political discussion is complicated, right? It's partly influenced by mercantilism and zero-sum ideas, that trade is a zero-sum game. So some of what we want to do today is push against that tradition and show you actually there are aggregate gains. And it's really important to think about that. Then on top of that, there are other forces such as populism, which may be influenced by these local geographic effects.
Say we have to put in protections because the little people might vote for the wrong person, I think is very dangerous for economists to go down that path.
No, I'm not trying to claim that. I'm not, definitely not trying to make a normative statement about what policy the
You said
economy
this might
should.
lead to populism, but
I
you're making
didn't-
that causal
right.
chain.
I meant it just as a descriptive sense that we have a tool here, to think about what trade does, and we're going to use that tool to inform these aggregate gains and these income distribution consequences. And what you think about those income distribution consequences, of course, tied up with your Pareto weights. Different people might have different Pareto weights. It's going to depend, exactly as you said, on what causes those initial income differences. Is it misallocation, or is it productivity differences generating high incomes? I totally agree with all of that. Those are all great points. What we want to do with the model is we want to highlight there is this juxtaposition of aggregate gains and distributional consequences, and it's important to pay attention to that. Furthermore, the distribution is geography as well as at the aggregate level, which has been neglected in much of the trade debate. Yeah, those are all great points.
I think economists ignore that at their peril, the political aspects. I mean, if you're thinking about all of these side effects, that's got to be one of them. If you think about the rise of communism and Marxism and all those sorts of things, you know, now populism, I mean, I think that's one. Economists, if they measure it, they should put it on the table too.
Our understanding of what causes people to vote for communists and populists is way below our nebulous understanding of how the economy works. But let's not get too
Let's see how the
sidetracked.
economy works. Anyway, let me dive into that. Let me show you some evidence on that. So let me tell you a bit about the data. How do we do this? Well, we put together a new data set for around 11,000 locations in England and Wales over around a century. The locations are called parishes, which historically provide local public goods. They also aggregate up into bigger units called poor law unions, about 585 of those, and counties, about 60 of those. What data do we have? Well, at the parish level, we have population by residents every census decade over that century. From 1851 onwards, we see employment by occupation or industry. So I'll show you some evidence on that on structural transformation related to Pat's questions. Then, as I also mentioned earlier, another nice thing about this empirical setting is we have these individual level population census data. So related to Steve's questions, we can actually track people over time and see whether an individual moves in response to the trade shock. Otherwise, you could only estimate relative changes in population. So we can use the individual level data to track people's mobility. Then another really key element to take the model to the data, population and employment not enough. You need something that's going to inform you about wages and rental rates and so on. And so one key ingredient is data on property values. So these are the market valuation of property values for property taxation purposes. We found the data in the House of Commons parliamentary papers, digitized it for about 7 years in between 1815 and 1896. And if I have enough time later, I'll show you how seeing employment and these property values with the structure of the model enables you to do a lot of things. Like I can solve for many things I don't see in the data, like wages, land rents, a lot of allocation of land across sectors using the structure of the model. And that's what's going to enable me to do the counterfactuals at the end. Because to do those counterfactuals, I need to know the values of the endogenous variables in the initial equilibrium before the shock happens. And so these data, together with the structure of the model, are going to let me fill in those initial conditions and hence do the counterfactuals.
Help me parse this bullet point there, land and buildings, value of land and buildings. So that means value of, in parentheses, land plus buildings, or you have them separate?
Some years there is some data on the two separated. In general, for every year, the data we have is on both together. But so it varies a little bit year by year what they actually report. You have the total value together. And in the model, I'll explain exactly what stand we take on how to interpret the property values in the model. And we have a robustness test in the appendix where we take a different interpretation and so on.
The buildings are sunk costs and they are in a sense miscalibrated to the new prices. So you think the long run might be different from what you estimate.
Right, so and that's one of those exercises in the appendix
Okay,
is
that's
will
fine.
allow an endogenous response in those land and buildings to the shock. As relative prices change, people will build or let buildings depreciate or build new buildings.
Fall,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm thinking about ways to proxy well-being of the workers who migrate, say, to cities. Is there a correlation between number of surviving children and well-being that one could look at?
That's
I actually messed around with these data much earlier for enclosures when I was a
Right.
grad student.
No, it's actually a great idea. Someone else made the same comment when I presented in the macro seminar here as well, thinking about health and mortality and fertility and things. Those outcomes are also measured in the data. We haven't done anything with them so far. I think it would be Janet Curry also made a related point. I think it'd be very interesting to look at that. That's something we haven't done so far. We will have a measure directly of poverty, though. Another interesting feature of this setting is Britain actually had a very old system of welfare transfers called the Poor Law. Those of you who read Charles Dickens will kind of know about that. But we've got some data, and we can actually show in these regions that were more heavily hit by this trade shock, you see an increase in pauperism, which is people applying for welfare relief to the local poor law board. And I'll show you some data on that later.
It's not if his health is positively correlated. I mean, for a lot of history, you move to the city, you get rich, but it's much more dangerous to
No,
you
I know,
physically. So
because
there's a
in the
negative
US,
correlation.
Actually, that's also super important. But another thing the model is going to allow for is when you think about moving to the city, the disease environment may be a big thing and may be changing over time. And so in the model, there are going to be some amenities which can change over time by location, which will help control for, as the disease environment deteriorates, the city becomes less attractive. So yeah, and so again, I'll play a big role in the model.
because I mean, even in the early 20th century of the US, moving from rural areas to the city often led to increased mortality, and particularly among children, because instead of milking your own cows, you had this, watered down stuff that you had to buy, and there was no FDA around.
And
Absolutely.
tuberculosis rampant
tuber-
all
not-
over the
not
place.
Poor
and coal
poor
smoke.
sanitation, reading Dickens.
So let me get in and show you some data. So what happens? So I'll show you two bits of evidence on the trade shock. So the first piece of evidence is relative prices. So this is the price of wheat relative to a price index of pastoral products. So that means milk, butter, cream, pork, mutton, beef, things you can produce with cows and pigs and sheep. And this is actually a relative price index. So both indices are 1 in 1701, and it's the relative value of two price indices, 1701. And so what do you see in this figure? Well, these vertical lines are relevant periods of time. So the first one here, so this is the outbreak of the Napoleonic Revolutionary War, 1792. This is 1815, the end of that war. This is 1846, the repeal of the Corn Laws, and this is 1871. And I'll say more about why that's relevant in a second. What are the red lines? The red lines are means within those different time periods. And so one of the key things you see in this figure first is that during the Napoleonic Revolutionary Wars, unsurprisingly, the relative price of wheat increases as Britain loses access to its main source of imports from the continent, rises by about 11% on average. Obviously, there's a lot of volatility because prices vary with the weather conditions and the harvest and so on. So then after the end of the repeal of the Corn Laws, in part because of the introduction of this more restrictive Corn Law, the price of wheat does fall in relative terms, but it still remains about 91% of its level before 1792. So the Corn Law is restrictive, it prevents it falling further. And then following the repeal of the Corn Laws, this relative price falls to about 78% of its level pre-1792. And then in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, after the end of the American Civil War and Midwest is connected to world markets, the relative price of wheat falls further. And if you look at this figure, you'll see that blue linear time trend there, which kind of shows you that after the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, there's basically this linear fall in the relative price of wheat. That there's a slow, gradual fall in the relative price of wheat, which is reducing the return to land relative to labor. And I'll show you some more evidence on that.
And I'm sorry, you stopped in 1900. If you said I missed it.
We could go a little bit beyond 1901, but the really big challenge is, so the spatial units we use are called these parishes, and they're fairly stable in the 19th century. But after 1901, they change a lot in the 1911 census. So for example, the City of London, the old historical centre of London, used to be 111 parishes, becomes 1 in 1911.
Okay.
So it's more complicated to go beyond 1901. But you could do something, but it's cleaner to stop in 1901. So this is the quantity counterpart of those relative prices. So what is this showing you? So the red line is estimates of British production of wheat. It's a quantity measure. These are 1/4 of tons of wheat produced. And then the red line plus the difference with the blue line, so going all the way up to the blue line. Blue line is consumption of wheat, which we're here proxying by production plus imports. Okay, so the difference between the blue line and the red line is imports. So you add domestic production together with imports, you get domestic consumption. And what's the key takeaway from the figure? Well, before the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1841, imports are pretty modest. They mostly come from traditional suppliers like Prussia and Russia. Following the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, you see this gradual expansion in imports. really starts to ramp up as we move into the closing decades of the 19th century from 1871 onwards. You see these widening imports, and you see a collapse in domestic production, consistent with the idea that trade shock is going to encourage you to do something else, to reallocate resources elsewhere. And then the other thing you see from these vertical bars is you see the source of the imports, that the New World is starting to become a major source of imports from 1871 onwards. So you see the United States emerge, and also Canada and Argentina as major sources of imports, consistent with this grain invasion from the New World. So how are we going to look at the effects of that shock? Well, we're going to exploit an idea or an observation that actually went back a long time. So there's in the mid-19th century, there's a famous seminal history of British agriculture in 1852 by Caird. If anyone's having a problem falling asleep at night, I encourage it. It's a very thick volume. It's a good read. But in that book, as part of it, he draws a line down the middle of England and Wales, this black line between what he calls the grazing counties to the west of that line and the corn counties to the east of that line. And then in the right figure, what we've done is we've overlain that line of Caird on top of the United Nations Global Agricultural Environmental Zones, a measure of agroclimatic conditions for the cultivation of wheat. So it takes into account soil conditions, temperature, precipitation, cloud cover, and so on. How suitable is this 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer pixel for the cultivation of wheat? And so yellow colors mean higher levels of wheat suitability. You can very clearly see that east-west distinction. You can also see there's quite a bit of variation within the two areas as well that we could also exploit in our empirical strategy.
It's more like a coastal disadvantage, so to speak, to reproduction than the east versus west.
So absolutely right. There could be a coastal advantage in terms of transport costs, and coast will affect temperature. So these coastal areas are a little bit cooler, as you're highlighting here. One of the big coastal effects is being on the west in particular, because you then get exposed to those ocean breeze, those moist ocean airs and North Atlantic drift, and that's why there's particularly heavy rain on the western coast. Yeah, so coast will also be relevant. Cool. So getting to some of Pat's questions, let me just show you some data on structural transformation just to provide the background, and then I'll kind of drill down and I'll try to address various kind of alternative explanations that I'm sure you're going to raise and I'm sure you've already thought about. So just to provide you some background, so this is 1851 is the first year we can see employment by occupation at the parish level. What I'm showing you here is the solid lines are in 1851. I'm showing you the employment share of agricultural laborers. So these are people who work on the land, but they do not own a farm and they do not rent the farm. They do not have a contract for renting the farm from anybody else. So they basically just have their labor. They're like day laborers working on the farm. That's an agricultural laborer. The other category are farmers, and they either own the land, but in practice, most people who own the land weren't farmers. The landowners, the aristocracy, that rented the land out to tenant farmers. And so these are predominantly tenant farmers who rent the land from the local lord or aristocrat. And so what's the takeaway from the figure? Well, I'm plotting here mean shares of employment in these two sectors, agricultural laborers and agricultural farmers, against essentially lines of longitude. So there's eastings of the British national grid. So it's basically west-east lines of longitude, the average employment share in each line of longitude. And so what you can see when you go from west to east is you see that the share of farmers in employment is fairly flat. It actually decreases a little bit as you go towards the east. In contrast, the share of laborers in agricultural employment increases quite steeply as you go to the east. Why is that? Well, relates to Hoyt's question. It's because arable farming is mainly in the east of the country and it's more labor intensive. You need more agricultural laborers. And so we show you some evidence in the paper that you see a similar thing if you look at agricultural production as well. Now, what else do you see in the figure? Well, when you go from 1851, the solid lines, to 1901, the dashed lines, you see that there's a modest fall in the share of farmers in employment, but there's a much bigger fall in the share of agricultural laborers in employment, and the decline is larger in the eastern parts of the country. So there's structural transformation, and it's concentrated in the eastern parts of the country. So let me show you that in a different way. Well, now I'm going to show you the same data in the top two panels, but instead of plotting it against west to east, I'm going to plot it against our wheat suitability measure. So this is the United Nations measure I showed you in the map earlier, just normalized to lie between 0 and 1. And then what am I showing you here? I'm showing you the change in the employment share. In the top left panel, this is for agriculture as a whole. The top right panel is for just agricultural laborers. Bottom left panel is for manufacturing. Bottom right panel is for services. So this is going to, what's this going to show? Well, consistent with the previous figure, you see that areas that are more suitable for growing wheat see bigger declines in agriculture as a share of employment, and that's mostly driven by agricultural laborers. It's the top two panels. What else do you see? Well, bottom left panel, this is kind of important. You also see when you look at manufacturing, the change in manufacturing's employment share is fairly flat against wheat suitability. Why is that important? Well, it helps us rule out some form of general equilibrium Dutch disease story. So you might think, well, maybe manufacturing is expanding a lot, and that's what's driving the decline in agriculture as the East. Well, it doesn't look like that's what's going on because the change in manufacturing's employment is pretty flat. And furthermore, the Industrial Revolution actually starts much earlier in 1760. There's kind of evidence that we're not capturing a GE effect from the expansion of manufacturing. So what's the main sector that sees a rise in its share of employment? Well, as agricultural laborers leave the land in response to this trade shock, you see a rise in the share of services, which is primarily people working for the local gentry and aristocracy. That's the main sector that sees a bigger increase in its share of employment. Now, to kind of further deal with some alternative potential explanations, we're now going to drill down and we're going to look within the agricultural sector. So what am I going to show you now? Well, I'm going to show you some county level data on the way in which land is allocated across alternative uses. So this is kind of helpful for our story. Why? Because when we're now looking within agriculture, so we can difference out any shock that's common to the entire agricultural sector and get identification just looking at different activities within agriculture. So the first year we can do this is 1878, because that's the first year where wheat is reported as a category in the agricultural census. So on the horizontal axis here, this is the share of wheat in land area as reported in the agricultural census. Each blue dot is a different one of the around 60 counties in England and Wales. What's on the vertical axis? Well, that's the change, not the log change, the change in the share of wheat in land area between 1878 and 1901. So what do I want you to take away from this figure? Well, if you look at the dots, they're all in the negative bit of the vertical axis, right? So we see following, in the second half of the 19th century, following this grain invasion, we see the decline in the share of wheat in agricultural land area. And, naturally that decline in shares is biggest in the areas that have the highest initial share. But notice how tight that relationship is here. It's very, very tight, suggesting that your initial specialization in wheat is really doing a good job predicting what happens to the change in your land area. You might worry, well, maybe that predictive power is just mean reversion, but you don't see the same thing if you do it for a different category of land use. So if you plot initial permanent pasture share, so this is grazing of cattle and sheep, against the change in permanent pasture share, it's actually flat. There's no similar relationship. And part of the reason for that is if I go back and plot wheat on the horizontal axis, so your initial share of wheat, and I plot the change in permanent pasture on the vertical axis, you see it's increasing. And this relates to John's question. What's happening here? Well, as this grain invasion hits, people are reallocating within agriculture to try to escape the shock, and they're reallocating towards pastoral farming. So that's going to be a margin we want to build into the model when we go to the data. So it's, again, it's kind of strengthening the evidence, and we're really picking up something within the agricultural sector.
But not to I would have thought about 100 other things you can grow on ground that you can grow wheat. They're not moving there.
So great question. Those other things are pretty small in the aggregate. So when you look at the shares data in the agricultural census, the big things are basically wheat, other corn crops, which is mainly barley, but also oats and maize, and then permanent pasture. They're the big ones. Then there's some other things like potatoes, turnips, and various things. But the cereals and permanent pasture are the biggest shares of land use.
Steve, I don't know if I'm getting
But related to that, total arable land area also goes down. So here I'm showing you shares within agriculture, but consistent with what your interpretation, total agricultural land area also goes down.
Well, Steve, are you going to get the backlash? I mean, getting back to John's question, because this is a huge, it's not that it just keeps going like this. In the backlash, in the fight for, in the case for tariffs made in England, at the end of the 19th century, in France and Britain, and it sort of tries to reverse all this.
Yeah, no, so that's a great point to make. So one of the reasons repeal of the Corn Laws is very influential in Britain is because it was such a cataclysmic political event. Britain stayed open to free trade for a while, whereas, as Michael said, in Germany and France, many continental European countries actually enact protection in the late 19th century to insulate themselves from the shock. But as Michael also said, later on, Britain in the 1910s, after the end of our sample, does move in a protectionist direction. And part of that was a debate about the distributional effect. So it is relevant to politics as well.
It seems the magnitude of that previous graph is is more relevant for John's question because you don't get perfect substitution away. You get very limited substitution away. You get the range of there is like 1/4, whereas the range of the y-axis is like 1/10 or less, right? So this is still a negative, consistent with your story, a negative terms of trade shock, even at long horizons.
Yeah, great question. So I mean, I would interpret the magnitude as being pretty big in the sense initial share goes from 0 to 25, and this goes to 0 to 10 percentage points. So that's pretty big relative to initial variation. You're right that the substitution is not going to be perfect, and that's actually something the model would take a stand on. There's going to be an elasticity that determines the substitutability of these different land uses. And so I'll show you that and how it plays a role in enabling the model to get close to some of these empirical moments.
Well, if the axes were the same, then at some level, there would be no long run change in the value of land. There's just the transition costs. Right?
So if that substitution elasticity is very high, then the
Yeah,
shock
exactly.
will not be very painful, but we don't find that because we see big increases in poverty, population redistributions, changes in property values, and we see this reallocation.
Right.
And you're right, that change in the data tells you something about the ability to substitute through the lens of the model. Yeah, so you see that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just a background question?
Mhm.
So in modern economies, we tend to see deindustrialization concentrated spatially associated with urban decay and rising crime rates. Was that true in this setting too, or did these just become sleepy, pleasant places where not much was going on?
That's another good idea to look at crime as well as Valerie's point about health. The thing we've done so far, if I have time, I'll show you some evidence on pauperism. So basically, if you wanted welfare support at the time, what you could do is you could go to the local poor law board and you could say, I'm destitute, I don't have any resources. And they would sort of try to see that you're telling the truth. And then for most of our period from 1834 onwards, if they say, yeah, I believe you, you then have to go and live in a workhouse, which is really unpleasant. You're separated from your children, your wife, you get fed gruel, it's really grim. It's not, but you wouldn't really want to do this. But so I can show you some outcomes on that. But you definitely see that increase in these eastern corn areas. So it's consistent with there being some real economic distress. I know there's some anecdotal evidence on crime that I read about when we were working on the paper. It's a good idea to try to get some data on crime. We haven't done that. It's another good idea as well as their health.
But that's the history of Australia. I mean, what did they do with these people? They shipped them there. I mean, really.
But,
But I wanted to ask you, Steve, if I were to do a back of the envelope on reallocation by geography and sector, because it's stable, the manufacturing employment share was relatively stable, but if I go more granularly geographic, so what happened to the people, so to speak?
yeah, geography is actually big there. So one interesting thing in the background is Britain moves out of agriculture pretty early. So if you look in the 1851 census, the first year we have the data, the share of agriculture in employment is about 22% in Britain at the aggregate level, so it's pretty low, but it's very spatially uneven. So if you look at some parishes, you have agricultural employment shares of 60 and 80%.
But you was what those people go after the.
I'll show you some stuff on that if I get time. Yes, yeah, but geography matters there. It's a very skewed distribution. The manufacturing is concentrated in big towns and cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, and so most of the country is still very agricultural, even though at the aggregate level, does not. Agriculture has already been quite a bit of structural transformation.
We focus on the corn laws because it's politically popular and it's a great economic story, but lots else was going on here. Steamships are invented, mechanization of agriculture is invented. How much of the price decline is we remove the tariffs and how much is all these other technological improvements for making it cheap?
Great question. I'll try to address that in two ways. So one is with the reduced form evidence, which I'll do that in a second. And then the other is inside the model where I can control for some of that other stuff. Just because you mentioned it here, let me make one point though, which I think I was about to make anyway, and so it's great you've raised it. Another reason this evidence within the agricultural sector is important is another competing explanation you could have is mechanization in agriculture, driving the structural transformation. There's sort of several reasons we don't think that's the explanation. So one is that the timing's a bit wrong. I'll show you some evidence on timing in a second. Mechanization starts in 1758, and there's something called the Captain Swing riots happened in the 1830s, which are about mechanization. But we don't find any effect in these eastern regions until later, until the time period when the grain evasion occurs. That's the first piece of evidence. Other piece of evidence is if you thought it's mechanization, it's very hard to write down a model where mechanization that increases the productivity of arable farming leads you to devote less land to arable farming.
I was thinking mechanization of US farming.
Right,
And the
absolutely.
steamship that made
Right.
it cheaper to bring the stuff
Right.
over and
Absolutely. So that is
how,
important.
how much, the world price, I presume, also went down from these forces, not just from the tariff. It's not
Absolutely.
just the tariff reduction that
Absolutely.
lowered the price of wheat.
And that's a really great question, and that's something we can also address. So in particular, you're right, the paper's about the grain invasion, so part of the shock is really this merging of the
Yeah.
New World grain. The reason I talked about the Corn Laws is it's kind of relevant for whether Britain's open or closed to that shock, so that's why it's one part of the story.
But it depends how much the tariff is. If it's a
Right.
percentage tariff, then you're still gonna get the shock. And the reason it matters is because would keeping the tariff have made that much difference? And if it's just the world price plus 20% and the world price goes like that, well, then it doesn't make a lot of difference.
So if you kept the Corn Laws in 1815, it would have made a big difference because they took the form of a price floor. So in particular, the price was fixed. You were prohibited to import when the price fell to a threshold. So you would have hit that lower bound, and so inflation would obviously adjust the real value of that, or you might update it. But the Corn Laws were kind of important because if they hadn't been reformed, domestic prices would have been insulated by that price threshold. But inside the model, we'll also try to address your question in the sense that we'll do two counterfactuals. We'll look at the price fall from 1846 to 1871, which is before the biggest grain invasion from the New World. So it's mainly capturing the initial reduction in the Corn Law protection. And then we'll do another counterfactual where we look at the impact of those last 3 decades, 1871 to 1901, when there's no change in trade policy, and it's all about the grain invasion. But yeah.
We're hearing a lot about this model.
Yeah, no, I'm
We're asking a lot of
Yeah.
questions. It's not his
I'll
fault.
do my best. I'll do my best to get there. So let me just, before I get the model, though, because I think this is important. This again relates to one of John's questions. So obviously, we don't want to claim the grain invasion is the only thing happening in Britain at this time. And so one of the things we do in the paper is we report event study evidence that enables us to control in a more reduced form way for these other stories, and then we'll also control for them in the model. So how do we do that with an event study? Well, we're going to regress the log of a parish outcome in location I at time t on parish fixed effects, time dummies, and then a whole set of interactions between being high wheat suitability above the median or below the median and year indicators. And then we're also going to include in the regression a whole bunch of observed parish characteristics indicated with a flexible set of year indicators. So what is this going to do? Well, these parish fixed effects are going to control for any level effect of these parish characteristics. If some parishes are better at one thing than another, or they're closer to the coast than another, that the fixed effect will control for that level thing. So any level effect of the characteristics goes into the fixed effect. The interactions with year dummies allow for heterogeneity in growth rates with the characteristics. So for example, one of our controls is distance to coal interacted with year. So to control for the fact that maybe coal will help the expansion of manufacturing. And so this lets us control for that in a flexible way. Distance to urban areas indicated with year. Distance to London, distance to Manchester as other possible factors. The results I show you, given the time, I'll just show you the two-way fixed effects of results. As you all know, there's been a lively literature on difference in difference regressions. If you have treatment heterogeneity, variable timing of the treatment, two-way fixed effects can be misleading. Here we have a single timing of the treatment, so that's not such a concern, but in the paper we replicate our results with the full suite of recent estimators. In our application, you get almost identical results, regardless of which estimator you use. So this is just, again, to a little address the timing. So what do we see in this figure? So these are the coefficients on those interactions between being above and below median wheat suitability with time. First half of the 19th century, we see no difference in the evolution of population in locations with high wheat suitability relative to low wheat suitability. In the second half of the 19th century, shortly after the repeal of the Corn Laws, we see a decline in the relative population of these high wheat suitable areas. And as I mentioned, just because it's come up a couple of times, well, you can also look at paupers per capita as a kind of measure of poverty. And you see, and particularly in the first 3 decades, you see this sort of rise in poverty and pauperism in areas which have high wheat suitability relative to areas which have low wheat suitability.
So the capita went down, the paupers might have just stayed the same.
It's true that capita went down. We reported paupers per capita because that's kind of a measure of your resource capability to pay for these paupers. So the pauperism is funded by local taxes. Yeah, I mean,
I'm curious, was the phenomenon people who could work moved out, or was the phenomenon people who could work became paupers?
We can ballpark it. So it's
Yeah.
20% booked in the next one,
20% in the next one.
and the other one is,
20%. Yeah.
just, you can do the numbers.
Yeah.
Taking it.
There is some genuine increase in economic distress.
Yeah.
Huge facts.
So now let me, I want to make sure I go to 120, right? I've got,
Yeah,
yeah.
120.
But do you want me to?
Oh, okay.
I can stop earlier if you want, just how you, yeah.
You've got plenty to say,
Cool.
keep going.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to
have
get to the
plenty to
model, that's
say
why
too.
I'm asking. But before I do that, I want to just show you these individual level data because I think they also help make it a more convincing story. So a cool thing about the setting is we've got these individual level data where we know people's names. And so we can match people across census decades. We can track them. So we follow kind of state-of-the-art record linking techniques used by Ran Abramitsky and co-authors here at Stanford. So we match people on their name, their year of birth, their county of birth. County of birth is pretty informative because England and Wales is a really small country, and so counties are a relatively small geographic area. So we get pretty high match rates. So these give you the numbers on how many people we match. In the bottom panel, those are the numbers of the total number of people. So in 1851, there were about 17 million people in England and Wales. For that first census decade, we match about 5 million of them across those two census years. One of the things in the data which really struck me, I was kind of surprised at how prevalent this is, are the high levels of mobility back at this period in time. So what you see in this table here is every census decade, around 40% of people move parish, around 30% of people move registration district, and around 20% of people move county. So you might be worried that maybe those mobility measures are affected by the name matching algorithm. You know, we do the best we can. We present a lot of evidence in the paper. The match quality is very high. A lot of the matches are unique. You might still always have that worry. Another nice feature of the England and Wales census data is for every individual, they're asked, what's your current county and what's your birth county? And so I can actually measure mobility without having to do any matching. And so you see that around 40% of people live outside the county where they're born. And the nice thing of that is it's easier to look at women because it includes everybody. Whereas obviously when you do name matching, there's a challenge that historically many women will choose to change their name on marriage. So a lot of mobility. We also find that mobility responds to the trade shock. So this is a very simple way of illustrating it. In the paper, we show regression evidence. So here we're comparing the first census decade we can match, 1851 to 61, which is before the full effect of the grain invasions occurred, to the remaining decades when the grain invasion reaches its full peak towards the end of the 19th century. And so what do you see? Well, the red line's above the blue line. So you see increased mobility in those later census decades. But then the other thing you see is that the gap is bigger in locations with areas of high wheat suitability. So mobility goes up more in these areas of high wheat suitability. And in the paper, we show it's driven by rural-urban migration, and it's driven by movements between industries. You typically simultaneously change region and industry, exactly as you might if you move from the rural area to the city. So again, kind of consistent with it's an individual response to this trade shock. So let me try to get into the model. So how are we going to think about this theoretically? So we're going to think about a world consisting of many locations, I and J, which are going to be our parishes. Consumer preferences are going to be defined over goods consumption for a number of different sectors. So agriculture, manufacturing, and services, where we'll interpret services as housing. We'll lump that together as non-traded services. Everything's non-traded. It's going to be in the services sector. Then within agriculture, to match to our data and to the experiment, we're going to have disaggregated agricultural goods. So we're going to distinguish between arable farming, G for grain, and pastoral farming, F for farming. And then we're going to think of our locations as being small open economies facing exogenous prices for the traded goods. So that's the arable farming product, the pastoral farming product, and manufacturing. And then obviously services are non-traded, so they're going to have endogenous local prices determined by market clearing. So we want to be rich in the model to allow for other things that can change in England and Wales over this period. So we're going to let these locations differ in their amenities, related to John's question about the disease environment and Valerie's question. We're going to let these locations differ in their average productivity, both by sector. So some places may be good at manufacturing because they have natural resources. Other locations may be good at agriculture and so on. And we're going to let those productivities change over time. So there could be faster productivity growth in manufacturing than there is in the service sector, exactly in the macro literature as we discussed earlier. So what's the sort of trick in the model that's going to make everything tractable and let us, we're going to be solving for equilibrium here in a high dimensional state space. We've got vectors of 10,000 locations. So we're solving for equilibrium wage vectors, equilibrium prices of non-traded goods in the high dimensional state space. What's the thing that keeps it all tractable? Well, we're going to be using properties of extreme value distributions. And so what's the trick? Well, we're going to think of each location as being endowed by a continuum of land blocks. So fee, indexed by fee, and Li is the measure of these land plots. So this is going to be land area in the data. And it's going to be this continuous measure of land plots in your location. And each of the continuum of land plots is going to draw idiosyncratic productivities for each of the alternative land uses. How good it is in agriculture, manufacturing, and services, how good it is at arable and pastoral farming. And that's going to put some curvature in the problem from the, and I'll show you exactly how in a second, from the extreme value distribution. And that's what makes everything tractable and makes it very easy to kind of compute the equilibrium and do the counterfactuals.
This is going to determine the substitutability across
Absolutely.
uses within regions. So how do you discipline that?
Absolutely. So I'll tell you how we calibrate those parameters. In the current version of the paper, we actually kind of tie our hands a lot. So we'll calibrate the parameters using the historical data for England and Wales, pins down some of the parameters. And then we'll typically take parameters from existing empirical studies and then just show you what our model predicts when we do the counterfactuals. And then we'll kind of compare those predictions to what we found earlier in the data. In principle, there are some other moments I showed you earlier you could actually use to estimate these parameters, but the stand we've kind of currently taken in the paper is we want to kind of tie our hands there, take those parameters, and then see to what extent the model can get close to what we saw in the data. So then each of these workers is going to be endowed with a unit of labor, and these workers are going to be mobile across locations. But again, we'll allow them to have idiosyncratic preferences for locations, which will again give some curvature and control the degree of substitutability in the population response in response to this trade shock. So let me tell you a little bit more in the details. So on the preference structure, we tried to kind of hew as close as possible to the macro literature on structural transformation. So we're going to have constant elasticity of substitution preferences across the three sectors, with an elasticity of substitution less than 1. So this is exactly the Baumol unbalanced growth case, which is standard in the macro literature. Capital B here, I are these amenities. This is how nice it is to live in a particular place. There's no time subscript here, but in the model, they can change over time in an unrestricted way across locations. I've just dropped the time subscript to reduce the notational clutter. These amenities come from an extreme value distribution, as I mentioned, in particular a fresh A distribution. So little b here, these are these idiosyncratic shocks. Each individual gets a shock, how much she likes living in a particular location. And that's drawn from this fresh A distribution. And so chi is basically going to control the population elasticity. When your real wages go up or down, what is the percentage response in population to that shock? How about within the agricultural sector? So in part, because we have only limited data on expenditure shares for agriculture, we'll assume Cobb-Douglas there. So this is a consumption index for the agricultural sector that's defined over arable goods, so cereal grains, and over pastoral products, milk, butter, the products produced by grazing animals. How about the production side? Well, on the production side, we're going to assume Cobb-Douglas technology, partly, again, for tractability, and partly because we're going to leverage this assumption a lot to solve a missing data problem. So in particular, Cobb-Douglas, combined with the things we see in the data, is going to let us solve for all the stuff we don't see in the data, but need for our counterfactuals. So we're going to use the structure of the model quite heavily, and I'll show you where I do that. So we've written the Cobb-Douglas technologies in the intensive form there. So Q is output per unit of land area. Little n is employment per unit of land area used in the sector. Z is a sectoral productivity shock for agriculture, manufacturing, services. And little a is a shock for these individual agricultural goods, arable and pastoral farming. Notice the way I've written it, those productivity shocks are land augmenting. Obviously with Cobb-Douglas, that's isomorphic, it's irrelevant, doesn't matter whether it's 6 neutral or land augmenting from the point of view of the production technology. The reason I've written it as land augmenting is when I solve for the equilibrium, I'm going to need to know the distribution of land rents across locations and across the different sectors. And normalizing the productivity shocks in this way is going to mean that distribution of the land rents has the same shape parameter. And so I'm going to be able to use a lot of nice results for extreme values with a common shape parameters to characterize that distribution of land rents and the decision which sector to use on a particular land plot.
Sorry, Miss, what about capital? You mentioned land.
Right, so the stand we take when we go to the data in the baseline model in the main section of the paper, we're going to interpret land and buildings in the data as land in the model. And so it's going to be inelastic.
Land.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so essentially buildings are going to be inelastic. In the appendix, we developed the extension with when there's a positive land supply elasticity, for example, as in Albert Seiss's work in the United States, and that land supply elasticity can be heterogeneous across locations. It's actually extremely tractable. The main reason why we adopted this specification is it hews closer to the Hexaronin model and the specific factors model in trade, which again make that assumption of inelastic
I was
supplies.
thinking about the differences, the amount of productive capital lets different areas be able to differentially absorb moving moving workers.
Right. So actually what it's going to mean in terms of the model is it's going to dampen the impact of the shock, this assumption that it's inelastic,
Got it.
because otherwise when you have a
Yeah,
negative
exactly.
shock, your land and building is going to decline and it's going to expand in the places with the positive shock. So this is going to tend to reduce the magnitudes of the effects we find relative to that extension. Yeah. Yeah, it's actually making it harder for us to find big effects. Yeah, so you're right. So in terms of aggregation properties of the model, because of that extreme value assumption, we get very clean expressions for the shares of land within agriculture allocated to the two goods. Depends, as you might guess, on relative prices and wages because factor intensity differs. That's why wages
Sorry,
matter.
workers are homogeneous.
Pardon?
Workers are homogeneous. I missed it.
Yes, workers are ex ante homogeneous. They're ex post heterogeneous in the sense they get this idiosyncratic preference draw, but they're ex ante homogeneous. Yeah. And then capital E here is a parameter that controls the average productivity of a location in a particular agricultural good. Again, because of the extreme value assumption, we get nice aggregation properties for the agricultural sector. So I can write the shares of land across the three sectors in the middle here, agriculture, manufacturing, services, as if there's an aggregate price, curly P, for agriculture, where this curly P is really an aggregation of the individual prices.
Because I was thinking,
for the
sorry, I'm
goods.
going slowly. I was thinking about that comparative advantage story could make differential segment of the workforce differentially more suitable for the
Yep.
various sectors and help you matching this mobility patterns in the data.
Right, so absolutely. So we definitely in the current version of the model, we're taking a stand as just this one homogeneous labor. To be honest, the historical population data are a little bit limited in terms we don't see education, we don't see a direct measure of skill. So
A lot of time trying to find occupation measures of
Right.
with Elora.
right, so
From
you
the
could do some
US
stuff with
Census, yeah.
occupations. One of the challenges is they're partly endogenous and the model will
Got it.
imply that endogeneity because it implies people move
Yeah.
away from agriculture. So it's partly we've taken that stand that we're going to write down the simplest model we can. It connects quite closely to Hexaronin specific factors, which make that assumption. But you're right, you can enrich it in a whole bunch of ways, and I think that would be super interesting to do. And then finally, we also get this nice result for population shares, again, coming from the extreme value distribution. So I guess you can all see immediately what's going to happen in the model. So it's pretty intuitive, right? We use the model to think about a trade shock that's concentrated in a particular sector, arable farming. What does that trade shock do? Well, as the price of arable farming goes down, you reallocate towards pastoral farming, you reallocate away from agriculture. People move away from regions that specialize a lot in arable farming, so the model captures all of those mechanisms. So as you saw in the reduced form findings, we're going to get structural transformation away from agriculture, reallocation to pastoral farming within agriculture, and rural depopulation from these eastern corn-growing regions.
I sort of lost track of what's exogenous, what's endogenous, and where did trade fit in here?
Right. Yep. Cool. So where does trade come in? The trade comes in with the Ps. And for the traded goods, those Ps are exogenous. For services, they're not. The P for services down here is obviously endogenous. It's going to be a local market clearing condition. I haven't written that down, but that's in the background. The Ps for the traded goods will be pinned down by basically prices on world markets and trade costs internally to get to the world market.
So you build in the structural transformation through the world prices moving you. If you would close it, they would not go anywhere right now, right?
And also the E's, right? Also these parameters here, these E's, these control the average productivity in a sector. So
You
these
gotta have those have T's on them, you suppress them?
exactly, so they have T's, they're time varying. So when we go to the data, they're going to be changing. That's what helps the model
I
match the
see.
data. That's what means the model can match the data.
T's, the world price is gonna push you away from the cheaper goods.
Yeah.
And then
What are the E's again?
So the E's is your average productivity in arable pastoral farming. The capital T's is your average productivity in
I see.
agriculture, manufacturing
so
services.
productivity and prices that are making you move.
It's a race. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah. And then the wages are going to be endogenous. It's going to be a labor market clearing
Yeah,
condition. Yeah. And so it's a race between the productivities and the rather prices. And so because everything's got a T subscript on it, that means the model can actually fit the data. So I can rationalize the observed equilibrium in the data as an equilibrium in my model, and then I can do a counterfactual starting from
When you
that.
do the population dynamics, how are you endowing the different regions with amenities, the ease?
Right, so great question. So what I'm going to do in the model is I'm going to use the model to think about the long run effects of this
Yeah.
trade shock. So I'm basically going to do comparative statics or comparative steady states. I'm not going to look at the transition dynamics. We have another extension in the appendix where we put in transition dynamics by looking at dynamic discrete choice migration decisions, which give you those transition dynamics. We could do more with that in the paper, but for the moment, given the scale of the shock, it looks like a secular shock, and so we've written down a kind of a secular model. But yeah, you could do more with transition dynamics if you wanted to.
So this is all analytic solutions from the formulas we're looking at here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Steady state, yeah.
But yeah, steady states, static, comparative statics. Okay, so I've got only a few minutes left. Let me just give you a flavor. So we calibrate the parameters, as I said, discussed it with Steve. We try to tie our hands. Let me give you a flavor for why the model is really helpful. We get a lot from its structure. What do we see in the data? We see relatively few things because in this historical environment, we see employment by sector, and we see these property values, the total value of land and buildings. And we see the share of agricultural land used for arable and pastoral farming and total land area. But we don't see things like the share of land used for manufacturing services we see it for agriculture as a whole, but not the breakdown between manufacturing and services. We don't see wages, we don't see rental rates. And so a lot of the kind of trick in the model is we've written down these assumptions so that we can actually solve for the things we don't directly observe. So for example, we can obviously compute an aggregate share of land in agricultural costs. It's just going to be a weighted average of the Cobb-Douglas shares for the two agricultural goods, using agricultural land shares, which are observed as the weights. We can actually back out wages using the Cobb-Douglas property that payments to labor are a multiple of payments to land, and we observe payments to land in our rateable values under our mapping land in the model to land and buildings in the data. So we can back out wages. And then we can get sectoral land shares for manufacturing and services using the fact that we see employment in manufacturing and services, and we're able to solve for wages and rental rates. So that means we can actually populate the entire initial equilibrium vector in the model, even though we only observe a subset of that vector because of the structure of the model. And then what's the key thing we're interested in, so related to Pat's questions, is we want to know, the way we've written down the model right now, lots of things are changing in the background to match the data, right? Productivity is changing as some places industrialize, services prices are changing, partly because of industrialization and so on. What we're really interested in is what was the exogenous impact of the grain invasion, holding everything else constant. But now we're in a position to do that. Why? Because, again, the way the model is written, we can use this technique of exact algebra from the trade literature. What does that mean? Well, it means you can solve for a counterfactual equilibrium if you observe the initial values of the endogenous variables either in the data or you can solve for them somehow. And we just discussed how we can solve for them. So we see all these initial endogenous variables, and then the only thing we need to assume is what happens to the relative price of arable farming. And then we can solve for everything. So in particular, to solve for this counterfactual, we actually don't need to know the levels of your productivity in each sector in the initial equilibrium. It's implicit in the background, and we can actually back it out. But to do the counterfactual, we don't need to know it. Why? Because the observed endogenous variables are proxying. Like if you're really productive in a sector, you're going to have a lot of employment there. And it's going to be reflected in your wages and your rental rates. And so the structure of the model, those endogenous variables are going to proxy for these unobserved levels of things. And so what is the kind of key takeaway from this counterfactual? So this is some of the key punchlines from the model. So firstly, unsurprisingly, we get substantial structural transformation away from arable farming. So this is a change in the share of arable farming and total employment in each location. Gray dots are our parishes, and the black line is just the linear regression. And I'm showing you the change between the counterfactual equilibrium minus the initial equilibrium. So there's a large reallocation away from arable farming. It can be as big as 30% in some of these rural locations, which are very heavily specialized in arable farming. And sorry, hang on one second, John. And then you can also look at movement out of agriculture. In the most heavily hit locations, the share of agricultural employment declines by around 15%. Yep, sorry, John.
Counterfactual is we calibrate the model to the initial equilibrium, then we put the final observed price in and see what the model says the final outcome should be.
Exactly. And so
it is the factual, it's just what the model says.
But it won't be, so we start in 1851 and we feed in the relative, the only thing that changes exogenously is the relative price on world markets.
Counterfactual is, what if all the other technologies and other things I brought up had not
Exactly.
changed? Just the effect of prices.
Now,
Is that right?
But that's different from this exercise up here, where we allow these other things because and the reason we do that is it kind of makes clear that the model is obviously not assuming The only thing in the data is
The
great.
counterfactual is not turning on the prices. The counterfactual is turning off everything else.
You could think about it like
Is
that.
that
yes.
right? Is it you got a path and you're taking it relative to the original path in the data and you're doing a counterfactual, but it's not from a point steady state and you're just doing it. You're doing like, you subtracted off the whole path of what otherwise would have been.
So you could do various
Which one are
things.
you, which one are you doing?
Because the model's static, we can do it from your initial point. You could also do it in the path. It would be equivalent because it's a static model. We're doing comparative steady states. If you had transition dynamics, then you'd have transition paths and you'd want to do it on the path.
But if there was some trends
Mhm.
in some of those productivity
Mhm.
shocks, and you had those in open or closed, and you had the trends closed, say, and trends open, and the P's are coming in. The way you do it, you can sort of subtract out the trended thing, not a static steady state, and then you can say, what's the differential effect to having an open close, can't you?
That's a great question. So you can do various things. So what we've done is we focused on the pure impact, the change in the price on world markets. What you're suggesting is also an interesting exercise, but it's another exercise, right? It's sort of saying, well, if the economy was closed, productivity growth would have been different in the different sectors. And so to do that exercise, we'd have to take a stand on what trend productivity was and how it would be affected by
doing
it.
that now.
We're not doing that. So we're focusing
Okay.
purely on the price effect in this counterfactual.
It's cleaner.
We thought it was a kind of clean way to focus on that, the impact of the grain invasion, that there's a shock on world markets. And what we want to know is what does that do everywhere?
Steve,
Mhm.
get back to
Mhm.
something that Cochrane said a long time ago.
Yep.
Let's say there was no change in tariff
Okay.
policy,
Uh-huh.
but the steamships and all the other technology came, what would you get?
But let me just get to this as a way of speaking to that. So related to this discussion we had at the beginning, so one of the big takeaways at the end is the aggregate gains from this shock. So because it's a neoclassical model, it's a change in relative prices. There are aggregate gains from trade. These three bars show you the aggregate gain between 1846 and 1901. This captures two things: the trade liberalization and the terms of trade gain from expanding New World production of grains. It's the net effect of those two things. It's around 3.65 percentage point increase in expected utility inside of the model. And then related to Michael's question just now, we break that down into counterfactuals for the two subperiods: the change in the price of grain between 46 and 71, which is mainly driven by the trade liberalization, that there is some integration of the New World, but it's before the big integration of the New World. And the last 3 decades, 1871 to 1901, the trade liberalization already happened. So that second period is the terms of trade gain from New World grain invasion. And we see in our data they're of roughly equal importance for that overall aggregate gain, the kind of terms of trade improvement from the New World and that initial trade liberalization.
Okay.
But I think I'm nearly out of time, so let me just make sure I flag these distributional effects we also started with. But the other counterpart of that is those modest aggregate gains go together with quite big distributional changes. So this is showing you log percentage changes in, well, firstly, let me do it for the rental rates. Oops.
Yeah.
This is the return to land. These are log changes in the rental rate. So it goes from declines of around 10 percentage points in the most heavily hit regions to increases in the lowest wheat suitable regions. And so this is another area where the model is helpful. Difference in differential regressions only get you relative effects. They can't identify levels, a missing intercept problem.
Yeah.
Inside of the model, the model gives us the intercept given the change in relative prices we feed in from the data. And so you see here that some locations actually benefit. So some landlords are benefiting as people move to towns, bids up the price of land in those areas. They're working in manufacturing, they can actually benefit. But there's this tail of rural areas that experience quite big drops in the price of land. And then this figure also shows you the change in real income, which is now the change in wages, land rents, and the change in the population distribution. And you see quite substantial changes in real income across locations. Some places still see a fall in real income, the ones that are most exposed to the shock. Many others experience a gain in real income, and in fact, the real income tends to be above zero. There tend to be these gains. Why? Because it's a trade model where there are aggregate gains, and so that tends to be, once population reallocates, that tends to be felt in many locations as well. So I'm basically
wrap up.
Yeah, I'm bang on time. So what do? We tried to revisit this distributional effects of trade. We looked at this big trade shock. Traditionally, distributional work on it has really looked at the aggregate level, labor and land, agriculture, manufacturing. We used geography as a source of exposure to the shock. we document that these modest aggregate gains go together with large distributional consequences across locations. And this is a setting where we think we can really kind of capture those distributional effects with this exogenous measure of exposure to the shock. But I should stop there to stay on time. Thank you very much for the great questions and comments.